Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. Today's session will be on Hegel and the Ontology of Power. Our first speaker today will be Arash Abazari. He obtained his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2017, and he has taught at Sharif University of Technology and Institute of Research in Fundamental Sciences in Tehran. And he is currently Humboldt Fellow at Goethe University in Frankfurt. Among his publications are the monograph, Hegel's Ontology of Power, The Structure of Social Domination and Capitalism, which was published in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, and a variety of articles on figures such as Fichte, Marx, and Hegel. So I'll just mention two. Forthcoming with the European Journal of Philosophy is the article entitled Fichte's Conception of the Body, the Intertwining of Sociality and Embodiment. And also forthcoming in the Hegel Bulletin is the article entitled Marxist Conception of Dialectical Contradiction in Commodity. And Arash will speak today about Hegel's Ontology of Power. Then we will have a response from our second speaker. So our second speaker will be Karen Ng. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. She focuses on 19th and 20th century European philosophy, especially Hegel and German idealism, and Marx and critical theory. So she's the author of the monograph Hegel's Concept of Life, Self-Consciousness, Freedom, and Logic, which is published in 2020 with Oxford University Press. And it received the Journal of the History of Philosophy Book Prize last year. She's also the author of numerous articles. I'll just mention two. So from 2019 is the article entitled Social Freedom as Ideology, which was published in Philosophy and Social Criticism. And from 2018, Life and Mind in Hegel's Logic and Subjective Spirit, which was published in Hegel Bulletin. So thank you both for coming. After Karen's response, we'll give Arash the opportunity to respond to the response. And after that, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So if I could just ask anybody who can to turn on your camera so we can all see each other. And for the questions, you can use the raise hand function in the reactions, or you can type in the chat as well. Okay, so without further ado, I hand the floor over to Arash.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I am very honored to be able to talk at Leuven University in seminar in classical German philosophy. So actually, I prepared a handout just in case that you don't follow my Farsi accent. So yeah, just if you just want. So actually, I have almost all the important details of the talk is presented in handout. So I start just reading from the text that I have prepared for this occasion. Okay, so I begin with my motivations for writing this book. So in Hegel's Ontology of Power, I attempt to develop a critical theory of society and capitalism on the basis of Hegel's science of logic, and in particular on the basis of the second part of that book, namely the logic of essence. In order to do this, I mobilize Marx's mature critique of political economy and Adorno's later social theory. Before going into details of the book, please allow me to explain my three main motivations for writing this book. The first motivation is concerned with my frustration with Hegel's official social and political philosophy as it is developed in the philosophy of right. The project of the philosophy of right to give legitimacy and justification to the bourgeois capitalist social order to what Hegel calls modernity. It is true that Hegel has a great realistic impulse and discerns some major problems afflicting the modern society. Nonetheless, he thinks that the modern society, despite its problems, is inherently rational. The modern society is rational, Hegel argues, because the main legal, economic, and political institutions of modernity embody and give expression to various aspects of freedom. However, given the actual historical experience since Hegel's death in 1831, I presume that it is evident that Hegel in the philosophy of right is unduly optimistic about the prospects of the modern world. At the conceptual level, we can say that there are two main problems with the philosophy of right, and both have to do with the way that Hegel conceives of the sphere of the economy. The first problem is concerned with the relation of the sphere of the economy to the sphere of political state. It is true that Hegel diagnosed some of the problems that capitalist economy engenders. Nonetheless, he felt that the modern state, being the actuality of concrete freedom, is able to regulate and tame the sphere of economy, such that the rationality of the modern society on the whole is maintained. In contrast to Hegel, and especially in the current regime of neoliberalism, it is almost self-evident that in capitalism, the state that was supposed to regulate the sphere of the economy is in fact regulated by the sphere of economy. Or in Alexander Herzen's catching phrase, in modern world, quote, the shopkeeper is at the helm of the world, forcing the government to become his shop assistant, end of quote. The second problem of the philosophy of right has to do with the way that Hegel conceives of the internal structure of the sphere of the economy itself. Hegel thinks that the sphere of economy is stratified culturally into different states with ES, Stände, roughly the agricultural, the commercial, and the administrative state. In doing so, Hegel conceives of the relation between various states or Stände as being horizontal and devoid of power. Importing medieval elements into his economic theory, Hegel does not realize that in capitalism, the bourgeois society is not divided into different states or Stände that harmoniously cooperate with each other, but in fact, the bourgeois society is divided into opposing classes, such that the interest of one class exclude the interest of the other class, and the relation between classes is vertical and indeed power-laden. My second motivation for writing this book is my frustration with the status of the contemporary attempts to revitalize Hegel's social and political philosophy. Perhaps under the influence of Axel Honneth's influential body of work, the contemporary scholarship on Hegel predominantly tends to focus on the concept of recognition or anerkennung, and conceives of the modern society as composed of various spheres of recognition. This interpretation of Hegel, even if it is textually correct, which is not, failed to realize that the structural regularities of capitalism, no matter how much the extent of reform is, cannot possibly accommodate the relations of symmetrical recognition in social and political sphere. Moreover, reconstructing the modern society on the basis of the relations of symmetrical recognition can potentially function as ideology insofar as it may mask the deep-seated relations of power and domination that in fact constitute the modern society. Finally, my third motivation for writing this book was my fascination with Hegel's dialectical logic, as it is expounded in detail in the science of logic and its relevance for understanding the modern society. Despite the fact that in the work of Honneth and also in Anglophone scholarship on Hegel, referring to the science of logic in the context of social and political philosophy is usually considered to be unjustified, there has been a rich tradition of using Hegel's dialectical logic to explain the structure of society in capitalism. Marx, Engels, Adorno, and Lukács, in one way or another, copiously engaged with the science of logic and used it to advance their own critical social theory. Similarly, in this book, I undertake a detailed analysis of the second part of the science of logic, namely the logic of essence, and show how it can be used to develop a critical theory of society in capitalism. So let me now talk about my aims in this book. Hegel is usually considered to be the philosopher of freedom, but when one reads the logic of essence closely, one realizes that Hegel forcefully uses the concept of power or Macht to explain the structure of substance, which is the last and the highest category of the logic of essence, and thus of the objective logic. I set my agenda to reconstruct the logic of essence on the basis of power in order to show how the development of the categories of the logic of essence from the beginning to the end is best understood as the development of various modalities of power. Showing the centrality of power in Hegel's ontology is one major task of the book, The other major task of the book is to show how Hegel's ontological account of power captures the structure of social domination in a historically specific social domination that is capitalism. The mode of domination in capitalism has two features that make it distinct from domination in pre-capitalist social formations. Firstly, while in societies based on slavery or serfdom, there is no claim of equality between masters and slaves or serfs. In capitalism, capitalists and workers are equal before the law. Importantly, the structure of domination in capitalism is such that it obtains not despite equality, but actually on the basis of equality. Secondly, while in slave or feudal societies, the relation of domination was direct and personal, a particular slave or serf was bound to a particular master. In capitalism, domination takes on an indirect and impersonal character. A worker is able or should ideally be able to change her employer, and yet she continues to be dominated all the same. To use Marx's own phrase, in capitalism, individuals are primarily ruled not by persons, but by abstractions, abstractionen. So I reconstruct the logic of essence on the basis of three major categories. Shine, which in this book I translate dependent on context as illusion or semblance, opposition or Gegensatz, and totality or Totalität. These three categories cohere with each other and together constitute a total system of domination, which I show is specific to capitalism. The book consists of 5 chapters and a conclusion, and in the following I give a brief exposition of each chapter. So, chapter 1, shine. Shine is the beginning category of the logic of essence, and Hegel claims that shine is the sublation or the supersession of Aufhebung of being in the realm of the essence, in the realm of essence. Therefore, in order to understand the definition of shine in the logic of essence, it is important to understand the difference between the logic of being and the logic of essence. The logic of being is the logic of the relation of Gleichgültigkeit. The relation of Gleichgültigkeit has two specific features. First, the two individuals that are in relation of Gleichgültigkeit are indifferent toward each other, which is to say that each individual has an inner core which is immune to and untouched by the relation that obtains between them. In other words, in the logic of being, the relation of individuals is not constitutive of individuals and remains external to their identity. Two, the logic of the two individuals that are in relation of Gleichgültigkeit are equal with each other, which is to say that the one determines the other in the same way and to the same extent that the other determines the one. In sum, the ontology that Hegel develops in the logic of being is an atomistic ontology. Hegel's exposition of this atomistic ontology in the logic of being is not to endorse it, but is actually to criticize it. To this aim, Hegel argues that the logic of being, due to its insufficiencies in determining the structure of individuals, has to give way to the logic of essence. The logic of essence has two characteristics which contrast it with the logic of being. First, the logic of essence is the ontology of absolute relationality, where individuals are not self-subsistent apart from their relations, but are defined through their relations. Second, the logic of essence is the ontology of power, where relations between individuals constitute a totality which exerts power over individuals. In other words, the ontology that Hegel develops in the logic of essence is holistic, where the relation between the whole or the totality to individuals is a relation of power. Yet at the same time, the whole or the totality does not exist above and beyond the relation between individuals, but is constituted by the relation between individuals. Hegel argues that with the advent of the holistic ontology of the logic of essence, the atomistic ontology of the logic of being does not simply disappear. Rather, the atomistic ontology functions as shine, i.e., as an illusion or as a semblance within the totality of essence. In order to understand Hegel's point, we can posit that the logic of being captures our common sense everyday ontology. In our everyday life, we consider ourselves atomistically as bearers of certain qualities like gender, nationality, profession, etc., or as bearers of certain certain quantities like the amount of wealth or income that we have, the level of our education, etc. But Hegel argues that such atomistic ontology is only a semblance. In fact, the qualities and the quantities that we bear are constituted holistically, i.e., in the fabric of the totality of society. While it is true that such atomistic understanding of individuals as totally distinct from each other is illusion, Hegel argues that such illusion is necessary. In our everyday life, we cannot but understand ourselves as bearers of certain qualities and quantities, and such illusion of individuals is part and parcel of the way how the social totality constitutes itself. So, the logic of being captures the structure of the market as it appears to the agent involved in economic activities. The two individuals who are engaged in economic transactions are indifferent towards each other. Each pursues his or her self-interest at an arm's length distance from the other. At the same time, the two individuals exchange commodities of the same value, and as possessors of commodities of the same value, they are in fact posited as equal. Moreover, the relation between the two is devoid of power. There is no coercion upon individuals to enter into a specific exchange relation. Marx sarcastically observes that the realm of the market is, quote, in fact, a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, and property, end of quote. However, Marx argues that the freedom and equality embodied in the realm of the market indeed functions as a shine, a semblance, which is to say that freedom and equality are a semblance that conceals the inner core of capitalism. In volume 3 of Capital, he emphasizes that, and this is the quote on the handout, the finished shape of economic relations in capitalism, as these are visible on the surface in their real existence, and therefore also in the intuitive awareness with which the bearers and agents of these relations seek to gain an understanding of them, is very different from the shape of their inner core, which is essential but concealed, and the concept corresponding to it. It is in fact the very reverse and antithesis of this. According to Marx, the sphere of the market is only a surface appearance of deeper social and economic processes in capitalism. Indeed, the market is grounded on and is actively supported by the sphere of production. Marx argues that while in the sphere of the market, commodities of equal value are exchanged, in the sphere of production, surplus value is appropriated without equal compensation. Moreover, while in the sphere of the market, the two individuals engaging in exchange consider themselves to be free in the sphere of production, in the sphere of production, the relation between capitalists and workers, or employers and employees is imbued by relations of power and domination. So in the book, I have elaborately discussed how the dialectic of shine in the beginning of the logic of essence helps us to understand Marx's method of the critique of ideology of equality and freedom in capitalism. Here, I would like to only note that Marx's analysis shows how ideology of equality and freedom is not a detachable layer of core mechanisms of power in capitalism. The ideology of equality and freedom cannot simply be discarded through enlightened reasoning or through a mere critique of ideology. No matter how much I have read the 3 volumes of Capital and have realized that capitalism is in fact permeated by relations of power, in my everyday life, I cannot but engage in economic transactions that presuppose equality and freedom of individuals. Equality and freedom are embodied in relations of exchange. They are, so to speak, the ideational component of the market and are thus objective. Nonetheless, Marx argues that since the market is not the whole sphere of the economy, but is only a part of it, equality and freedom, which are required in the sphere of the market, are simultaneously negated or undermined in the sphere of production. In other words, in capitalism, equality and freedom are both and at the same time required and undermined by the logic of capital. So let me now begin with my chapter 2. So in my reconstruction, the major category of the logic of essence, the second major category of the logic of essence is opposition or Gegensatz. Thus, in the second chapter, I argue that the most fundamental form of relation that obtains between individuals is the relation of opposition. And the relation of opposition in its most developed form is a relation of domination. These two claims established that Hegel's ontology is the ontology of power. This implies that for Hegel, individuals are not separable from the relation of power. Rather, they are constituted in and through the relations of power. For Hegel, the relation of opposition obtains between the categories of the positive and the negative, say between plus A and minus A. And I should add in this context that the positive is a technical term for Hegel here. It shouldn't be confused with the phrase like the positive social sciences or the positivist social sciences. The positive and the negative for Hegel are both relational terms. So importantly for Hegel, the positive and the negative are solely derived from the relation of opposition that obtains between them. Each of the positive and the negative excludes its other, yet at the same time achieve its own identity entirely through to the relation of its other, to its other. Although the positive and the negative are solely defined relationally, this doesn't mean that they are simply exchangeable. Rather, the positive for Hegel is primarily a self-centered individual that only subordinately relates to the negative in order to secure its identity, while the negative is primarily a decentered individual which achieves its identity primarily through relation to the positive. The relation between the positive and the negative is therefore asymmetrical, and thus a relation of power. That is to say, although the positive and the negative co-determine each other, the positive enjoys the privileged status to which the negative must necessarily refer to. The relation of opposition must be contrasted with the relation of diversity or Verschiedenheit. In diversity, an individual is related to any arbitrary other. So for example, A is related to B, C, D, or etc. In contrast, in opposition, each individual relates to its own personal and singular other. Like plus A is related only to minus A. For Hegel, opposition is more determinate than diversity, and diversity always presupposes opposition as its ground. In our everyday life, we tend to conceive of individuals as diverse, each as self-subsistence on its own and as simply different from others. Such diversity, however, is an illusion, or it is a shine, and a constitutive illusion which masks the deeper relation of opposition. I will then discuss how Marx's conception of the opposition between capital and labor at the logical level accords with Hegel's conception of opposition. According to Marx, value is solely created by labor. Simply owning the means of production does not create any value. Capitalism is based on private ownership of means of production, and the means of production is owned by capital. Consequently, the value created by labor upon its very moment of production belongs to capital. Labor therefore constitutes capital, which at the same time excludes it from itself. That is to say, labor is the negative that primarily exists not for itself, but for capital, which functions as the positive of this relation. Like Hegel, for whom diversity functions as a semblance, for Marx, the seeming plurality of the relation of capital and labor in various economic settings in capitalism, say in Sweden, in China, or in the United States, is a semblance which hides the essential nature of the relation of capital and labor, the essential nature that is defined in terms of opposition and domination. Finally, I demonstrate how Catherine McKinnon's conception of gender formation accords to Hegel's conception of opposition. McKinnon does not discuss Hegel, but it is not surprising to see the close proximity of the two, since McKinnon's account primarily is based on the analysis of relations of power. For Catherine McKinnon, the relation of domination does not obtain between otherwise independently existing male and female, but the very categories of male and female are constituted through the relation of domination of male over female. That is to say, for McKinnon, there is no stratum of human commonality. This is a quote from McKinnon, that there is no stratum of human commonality underneath men and women. Rather, such supposedly human commonality is simply the male standard. Translated into Hegel's language, for McKinnon, male functions as the positive to which female as the negative must necessarily relate in order to define itself as female. So the relation of, I have now 3 chapters about the conception of totality, which is a major part of the book, and I go through each chapter because then it gives a whole picture of the whole book. So the relation of domination between two opposing individuals is not sustainable on its own. It must rather be grounded in a context, in a totality that supports such a relation. Given the centrality of the concept of totality in the logic of essence and in capitalism, I devote 3 long chapters to explicating it. In chapter 3, I first flesh out Hegel's conception of totality in the logic of essence, and then in chapter 4, I show that Hegel's conception of totality undergirds Marx's conception of the totality of capital. Finally, in chapter 5, I discuss what it means that the power of totality over individuals is necessary both in Hegel's logic and in capitalism. First, let me talk briefly about Hegel's conception of totality in the logic of essence, which I discussed in the book in chapter 3. Hegel's ontology in the logic of essence is relational. That is to say, for Hegel, individuals are not separable from the relations that obtain between them, but are derived from those relations. The ontology of relationality commits Hegel to conceive of the totality of relations as prior to individuals, as that which constitutes the individuals. I reconstruct part 2 and 3 of the logic of essence in terms of the development of the concept of totality. Hegel ultimately conceives of totality as substance which exerts absolute power or Macht, absolute Macht over individuals, which are its accidents. So for Hegel, totality eventually is substance or substance, and the individuals function as accidents. So the totality of substance exerts a rich array of causal power on individuals that constitute it. According to Hegel, substance has creative power over individuals insofar it causes them to come to be. It has at the same time destructive power over them insofar as it causes them to cease to be, thereby substituting them with other individuals. Individuals might have the illusion or shine that they have power over one another, yet such power in truth is the power of substance, which in Hegel's own words posits an unequal value between the individuals. As the power of substance is constitutive of individuals, in the normal course of affairs, it is not visible to the individuals. It becomes visible, though, when individuals endeavor to trespass the boundaries of the possible space for action that the totality of substance has set for them. In such cases, the power of substance becomes manifest violence or Gewalt, which is able to coercively restore the normal status of substance as a self-maintaining totality. So this is the category that Hegel uses in the science of logic, in the logic of essence, both Macht and Gewalt. In order to show the radicalism of Hegel's conception of power, I contrast Hegel's power of substance with John Searle's conception of power. For Searle, who formulates a liberal and juridical conception of power, power is always 1, volitional, and 2, personal. By contrast, for Hegel, the power of totality is emphatically 1, non-volitional, and 2, impersonal or anonymous. Indeed, Hegel relates the non-volitional and impersonal power of substance over individuals to the Greek conception of fate or Schicksal. In contrast to Christian conception of God, for Greeks, the power of fate was blind, impersonal as well as non-volitional. Finally, I finished this chapter by explaining the significance of Hegel's conception of substance for social ontology. For Hegel, the totality of society is sui generis and is able to sustain and reproduce itself through individuals. Although individuals are always necessary for totality, a particular individual is dispensable and can be replaced with another individual. Okay. So chapter 4, which is about the totality of capital. The logic of essence is the ontology of absolute relationality, where individuals are defined through the relation between each other. Hegel's ontology of absolute relationality in the logic of essence captures the specific structure of society in capitalism. According to Marx, the structure of society in capitalism is absolutely relational. The principle that makes society absolutely relational in capitalism is the relation of exchange or austausch of commodities. However, what makes capitalism in contradistinction with previous societies a system of absolute relationality is not the mere presence of exchange of commodities. Rather, the absolute relationality in capitalism obtains through universalizations of the relation of exchange. So Hegel's ontology in the logic of essence is absolutely relational. In some sense, the highest category of the logic of essence is relation, or what he calls reflection. And for Marx, also the highest category, or the category that always permits, not the highest category, the category that permits in the entire fabric of social life in capitalism is exchange. And so it makes it, these two make them somehow correspond to each other. And of course, the universalization of the relations of exchange in society in capitalism makes capitalism in totality. In chapter 4, I reconstruct Marx's concept of totality of capital and specifically show how it exerts absolute power over individuals. Contrary to neoclassical economic theory, Marx argues that it is not up to individuals whether or not they would like to enter into the relation of exchange. Although I might be free with regard to what kind of commodities I would like to exchange, according to Marx in capitalism, I'm absolutely unfree with regard to the fact that I have to enter into the relation of exchange. In capitalism, the totality of the relations of exchange function as a fate or verhängnis from which nobody can flee. Individuals must abide by the logic of capital if they don't wish to be perished. In the book, I elaborate on how Marx's conception of capital embodies Hegel's conception of substance in the logic of essence. Indeed, Marx himself describes capital as a self-moving substance, sich selbst bewegende Substanz, which is able to produce and reproduce itself. While individuals are always necessary for the function of capital, i.e., it is only through the action of individuals that the totality of capital is constituted, but a particular individual is always dispensable and can be replaced with another individual. Capital for Marx is sui generis because it can produce the necessary ambience for its own thriving. That is to say, capital is able to reproduce and sustain the very social relations that are necessary for the existence of capital. It can reproduce capitalists on the one hand and wage laborers on the other hand. What especially secures the sui generis character of capital is the relative surplus population which constantly obtains in capitalism. No matter what the natural rate of growth of population is, the function of capital necessarily renders masses of people unemployed. The existence of the unemployed, which Marx calls the industrial reserve army, puts downward pressure on the wages and thereby providing a favorable ambience for capital to grow. The absolute power of the totality of capital over individuals is always mediated by the objective illusion of the power of individuals over one another. Such absolute power has an impersonal character, since individuals exert power over each other, not qua private individuals, but qua personifications of economic categories. This is Marx's phrase, personifications of economic categories. The power that a particular capitalist or a particular employer exerts over a particular worker or particular employee is not by virtue of her own personality, but by virtue of the fact that she occupies the social slot that allows her to exert such power over others. Moreover, the power of capital over individuals is non-intentional. Although capital is able to produce and reproduce itself, it does so as it were blindly and automatically. Capital is not a free subject that has volition or purpose, but it is, in Marx's own words, an automatic subject, automatische Subjekt, that blindly follows the laws of maximization of profit by which it is defined. So chapter 5 discusses the dialectic of necessity and contingency in Hegel's logic and explains what it means that the power of totality over individuals is absolutely necessary. For Hegel, necessity does not exclude contingency, but actually evolves out of contingent phenomena. The behavior of one individual bacterium is contingent and as such cannot be explained. Yet, this doesn't mean that the behavior of the bacterium in question is completely random. Rather, the behavior of the individual bacterium follows from the necessary regularities that the species has. The necessary regularities that themselves are the result of the interaction of contingent individual bacteria. The dialectical conception of necessity and contingency is underpinning the structure of modern society and testifies to how Hegel's logic is indeed historical. In capitalism, according to Marx, there cannot be any conscious or central regulation of production. Rather, production in capitalism is based on private property and private investment of individuals, and therefore, from a social point of view, has an essentially a non-regulated or anarchic character. However, such anarchic character, which appears on the surface of the bourgeois society, is nonetheless defined by the necessity of the laws of capitalist economy. Marx emphasizes that the disproportions, incongruities, and fluctuations that occur through lack of central planning are not a defect of capitalism with regard to maintaining itself. Rather, they are necessary for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves sich durchsetzen as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. Marx details how in capitalism the anarchy or the anarchy of the market and the despotism of capital mutually condition each other, which is to say that the anarchic competition between capitalists forces them on pain of perishing to extend their control in the workplace. Finally, I end this chapter with a discussion of the nature of freedom in capitalism. The freedom that obtains for individuals in capitalism is not the freedom of self-determination, but the freedom that obtains through contingency. One main form of this freedom, qua contingency, in capitalism is the freedom of consumption. Since the worker receives his wage not in kind, but in money, he is able to spend it as he pleases. Yet whatever he contingently chooses to purchase, he inevitably contributes to the process of accumulation of capital, which in fact subjugates him. The other main form of freedom in capitalism is the freedom for the workers to change their employees. In contrast to slave and feudal societies where there has been a necessary personal bond between an individual slave and an individual master, or between an individual serf and an individual lord, in capitalism, the bond between a particular worker and a particular capitalist is contingent. Yet such contingency, which appears to the worker to be his own freedom, is in fact only an illusion. Although the worker can sell his labor power to any capitalist, he is nonetheless necessarily forced to sell his labor power to the capitalist class. Okay, finally, the conclusion of the book. In the logic of essence, individuality remains a semblance or illusion or shine. Hegel discusses the illusion of individuality in the logic of essence from various viewpoints. First, individuals seem to be diverse from each other. Each takes itself to be different from the other, but it turns out that such diversity is an illusion. And in fact, individuals are determined by a relation of opposition between them. Second, individuals seem to be self-standing on their own, but such self-subsistence is indeed an illusion, and in fact, individuals are accidents of the totality of substance. Third, the constitution of individuals seems to be contingent. It seems that each individual can simply be otherwise, but in fact, such contingency is governed by the necessity of the law-like regularities of the totality. And finally, individuals seem to be free and self-determining, but such self-determination is indeed an illusion. And in fact, individuals are constituted by the power of totality. Of course, in Hegel's own science of logic, the logic of essence is not the end of Hegel's exposition of the logical categories. Rather, the logic of essence is sublated in the logic of the concept. In contrast to the logic of essence, when there is only a weak, mutilated individuality, in the logic of the concept, Hegel aims to develop a strong, full-fledged, genuine conception of individuality. In order to do so, he proposes that individuality must be conceived as a moment within the larger structure of what he calls the concept or the Begriff. In contrast to the totality of essence that is characterized by relations of coercive power, the totality of the concept is the realm of freedom where relations of free love and boundless blessedness rhyme. And these are the quotes from Hegel. That is to say, while the totality in the logic of essence is oppressive, the totality in the logic of essence, the totality in the logic of the concept provides the necessary background conditions for individuals to thrive. So in the realm of social philosophy, Hegel thinks that even if the laws and regularities of the market society are by and large governed by the categories of the logic of essence, the modern state is able to tame the excesses of the economic sphere, thereby facilitating the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept. Using Marx's early critique of Hegel's doctrine of state, I argue that the state in capitalism cannot successfully discharge the task of bringing about genuine universality, and that the state in capitalism remains bound to represent the interest of capital. Thus, within capitalism, the desired transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept cannot possibly transpire, and as long as capitalism persists, we are bound to repeat the logic of essence again and again and again. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that very rich talk. And I now hand over to Karin.
So let me stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Thanks so much, Arash, for your talk and for your really brilliant book. Thank you, Karin, also for inviting me here. This is such a great seminar and it's nice to be back. But I really like, you gave a really excellent, I think, summary of the book, but I learned so much reading it and I just want to just recommend it to everyone because it's a really great book. So I'll just start by, having said that, I'll start by saying that I'm pretty much deeply sympathetic with Arash's project, which enlists the conceptual apparatus of Hegel's science of logic towards building a critical social theory, and more specifically, a critical theory of capitalism. As Arash just told us, very eloquently, the main source of Hegel's critical theory is not the official social and political philosophy in the philosophy of right, but the doctrine of essence in the logic, which provides the categories for a relational ontology of power. So basically the categories of the Wesenslogik, so Schein, Gegensatz, and Totalität, but also Substanz and Macht, and Arash also talks about, as he just mentioned, necessity and contingency and whole and parts. Pretty much almost all of the categories of the logic, of the Wesenslogik are taken up in the book. These are the categories that underpin and allow us to grasp capitalism as a structure of social domination. And Marx's own critique of political economy both employs and is greatly illuminated by an investigation into Hegel's categories. So although Hegel's official social and political philosophy basically ends up defending the capitalist marketplace as a necessary and ethically significant sphere of mediation, what the categories of the Wesenslogik reveal is a more critical analysis of capitalism's functioning. In addition to relying upon shine and other forms of necessary illusion, and Arash's book also includes a really helpful discussion of Adorno on this idea of necessary illusion. Capitalism basically functions as a system of social domination whereby totality exercises absolute power over individuals. So despite capitalism's purported advance of individual freedom, it ultimately fails at determining or even enabling full-fledged, unreduced individuals. What the doctrine of essence provides, as he's just told us, is a social ontology of weak or mutilated individuality, which turns out to be the true ontology of capitalism. So not only am I sympathetic with this sort of overall project of enlisting the logic for critical social theory, I'm also in agreement with Arash on another central issue, which is the way that he understands the logic itself as really interested in tackling this issue of the determination of true individuals. I think he's absolutely right to point out the ways that in the doctrine of being and the doctrine of essence, and then I'll say a bit more about the doctrine of the concept, how in each of these books, Hegel is trying to conceive of individuals in a different way. I think connecting this key conceptual problem of the logic with the normative and social ontological problem of individuality within capitalism is an incredibly productive way of rethinking the relationship between Hegel and Marx, as well as between Hegel and critical theory. However, this leads me to an observation, which Arash himself discusses, that will guide my questions and comments, namely that for Hegel, there is both a conceptual and broadly ethical solution to the problem of individuality, whereas on Arash's reading, this conceptual and ethical solution is unavailable within the institutionalized social order of capitalism. So the conceptual problem of individuals is solved for Hegel, as he well knows, in the doctrine of the concept. True individuals are determined not only through their qualitative and quantitative characteristics, nor even through their essential relationships, although both of these kinds of determinations are, of course, very significant, but true individuals are determined through their concept. So true full-fledged individuality obtains of something that stands in a necessary relation to both particularity and universality, and this fully developed sense of individuality for Hegel is exemplified in the living individual and in self-consciousness. So that's the conceptual solution. The broadly ethical problem of individuality has a complex history, which Hegel tells with varied degrees of success. But in the philosophy of right, he also presents a relatively clear solution that he thinks obtains to some degree in the modern world. Self-determining individuality emerges through participation in loving relationships in the family, affirming our uniqueness as individuals, through participation in self-interested market relations, affirming our particular inclinations, talents, and professional associations, and through participation in the universal concerns of the state, what we might call the common interest, affirming our status as individuals of an ethical community that fundamentally shapes who we are. So for Hegel, not only is the society that produces true individuality shaped by the moments of the concept, the individual free will, as he discusses in the introduction of that book, right? The free will also wills itself in accordance with the three moments of the concept. So in short, Hegel's philosophy tackles this problem of individuality, both conceptually and ethically, through a logic of the concept. So this raises, I think, a number of questions for Arash's deployment of the logic for a critique of capitalism, which not only relies primarily on a logic of essence, but I think more importantly, it has to exclude the logic of the concept. So the thesis of the book is basically that we understand the critique of capitalism through the Wesenslogik, and there's no possibility of realizing something like a logic of the concept within capitalism. The first question I have then is a very general one. How does Arash understand the relationship between the logical categories on the one hand and natural and social reality that expresses logical form on the other? I don't mean, in asking this big question, I don't mean to impose a stubborn or stark separation between logical form and natural and social reality. And Arash's deployment of the Wesenslogik of the social ontology of capitalism leads me to ask this question in a more specific direction. It's clear that Arash is sympathetic with the ontological reading of the logic, in which logical categories are also an ontology. And in his book, he writes, I'm quoting here from page 7 of his book, "The logical categories are not self-standing, but shadow or track the empirical world. And the empirical world for Hegel is developed in history." I don't disagree with this per se, but I think this is not fully enough to address the question of the relationship between logic and social reality, since it looks like there is no being or social reality that corresponds to the Begriffslogik. What then is the logic of the concept? Is it an empty form? Is it a utopian form? If one of these answers is Arash's view, I would just note that I think this is definitely not Hegel's view, and arguably it might not be Marx's either. Hegel's view certainly would tend towards the opposite, namely that it's actually the Begriffslogik that's the most real, the most concrete, expressing the genuine reality of things, and the Seins- and Wesenslogik only express abstract or not fully realized truths. Okay. So that's the first question about the relation. How does Arash understand the relationship between logic and natural and social reality, especially given that the Begriffslogik is excluded? So second, while I'm sympathetic to criticisms of the philosophy of right, Arash's reliance on the logic of essence overlooks the importance of the logic of the concept, I think, for Hegel's account of ethical life. Instead of the threefold structure of the concept, Arash focuses on the category of substance, which functions as a totality exercising absolute power over individuals. I think a case could be made that for Hegel and for Marx, the categories of substance and power are insufficient for an analysis of ethical life and political economy, respectively. So these second set of questions are basically sort of trying to pose a challenge to the importance of the categories of substance and power for both Hegel and for Marx. I've already noted how the institutional structure of ethical life, along with the structure of the free will, are modeled on the logic of the concept. But at a more fundamental level, Hegel's critical post-Kantian approach to the category of substance consists in grasping that, quote, substance is essentially subject, everyone knows that line, which challenges the logic of substance and accidents, in which individuals are akin to accidents subject to the absolute power of substance. This critical post-Kantian approach to the category of substance means that there is a self-conscious reflective relationship to the determination of substance's powers. Thus, although Hegel indeed discusses ethical substance and ethical powers in the philosophy of right, ethical life exhibits the power of substance as subject, which is made clear when he writes, and this is just a quote from the philosophy of right, where he talks about ethical substance, and he says that, quote, "The ethical substance as containing self-consciousness, which has being for itself and is united with the concept, is the actual spirit of a family and a people." So ethical substance then is not a totality that exercises absolute power over individuals, but it expresses the power of individuals in their self-conscious relationship to the ethical totality. So some of this is in the book, Arash has a very sophisticated account of ethical substance, and he also tracks the differences between, say, someone like Spinoza and how Hegel's taking up the category of substance. But I think I still have some questions here about how the category of substance is being employed in his understanding of the idea of ethical substance. Okay, so this last point here is about Marx. And what I want to say is that I would argue that for Marx too, his appropriation of the category of substance is broadly post-Kantian. And so his critique of political economy operates on the assumption that human beings relate self-consciously to their productive activities as well as to the conditions of production. So Arash refers to the power of substance and to the power of capital to produce and reproduce itself. But properly speaking, these are not powers of substance, according to Hegel's account in the Doctrine of Essence. The power of self-reproduction is not a power of substance, but only a power of Selbstzwecke that are not exhaustively determined through the necessity of mechanistic causality. As Arash himself notes, an important feature of Marx's critique is to reveal the inversion whereby capital acts as a living subject. But beyond the appeal to subjectivity, Marx also relies on other categories, many other categories, I think, beyond the Wesenslogik, writing that capital is a Selbstzweck that, quote, brings forth living offspring. So to understand the self-valorizing process of capital, then, Marx, I think, employs categories from Hegel's subjective logic, most importantly, the categories of purpose, life, and self-consciousness. The categories of essence are not, in fact, sufficient for grasping capital's movement and process, nor its fundamental animating force, namely labor power. I emphasize this point because I think it challenges the power of substance, pardon the pun, as a critical concept, and maybe even the category of totality then, because I think Arash's, the main idea is totality, but the concept of totality is developed through the category of substance. But I think it challenges the power of concepts like substance and maybe totality as a critical concept, as a concept that is useful for a critical theory of society. So we can put it this way, whereas substance is a pre-critical or dogmatic concept that excludes the power of self-conscious, self-determining individuals, I think it's important to read Marx's critique of political economy as a critical project in the Kantian and post-Kantian sense of that term. So real living individuals participating in a social totality, despite domination, despite ideology and the dangers of false consciousness, have the power to self-consciously relate to the conditions of their productive and social reproductive activity, and thus have the power to criticize and reshape that social totality. This is perhaps most evident in the writings of the early Marx and the theory of historical materialism, which revolve not around the categories of substance and power, but the categories of self-consciousness and life. I would argue that the critique of political economy must likewise revolve around these categories, without which there is no path out of the conceptual aporias of the Wesenslogik, nor out of the social organization of capitalism. And in a way, I think Arash basically kind of said something to that effect when he ended his talk by saying that we're sort of stuck to, we're sort of doomed to repeat the logic of essence again and again. So, okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for raising those very interesting and probing questions. I guess there are going to be a lot of questions from the audience, but before we move to the Q&A, do you want to briefly respond to some of those points?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Karen, for your excellent comments. So let me see. So the first question was about the relationship between social forms and logical forms and natural forms or social forms. I mean, the way that in general I understand this relation, I mean, there are some people, most important, like Stephen Houlgate, for example, or Robert Stern, that they think that Hegel's logic is absolutely a priori. So it's a kind of a priori philosophy, and thought just engendering new categories of thought. And I don't think that that is Hegel's position. And I think the way that I understand Hegel is a kind of I borrow it from Aristotle. So for Aristotle, for Hegel, in the beginning of the encyclopedia, he says that there is an important place in philosophy for Nachdenken, thinking over, and the way that it works is one starts from the empirical phenomena, natural or social phenomena, and try to find some kind of rational principles that somehow are to explain those phenomena. but then one extracts some kind of rational principles, but then again one has to relate those rational principles back to the phenomenon and try to explain the phenomena through the rational principles. So one time one moves from the phenomena to the rational principle, and the other time one moves from rational principle to the phenomena. And as a result of this kind of back and forth movement, then like a whole of philosophical science will be established, that some parts of it can be called a priori, but not in the sense of Kantian sense that there is a strictly a priori, but in the sense that they shape the deep or intelligible structure of the phenomena, which cannot be exhausted through empirical reports. So this is the general way that I think that Hegel's logic is empirically informed. It's not an empiricist project, of course, but it is empirically informed. But then the question comes, and I felt that there's like, although Hegel, was living somehow in the beginning of like capitalist development in Germany, but he was also very cognizant of political economy in the work of Smith, Stuart, and other people in England, and he knew what is going on in capitalism. So and I think that like this is also a thesis of Lukács, that he says that Lukács thinks that like whenever Hegel talks about anything, his most important concern is always social and political. So even if when he talks about logic, his concern is more social and political, and so he extracts somehow the categories from that can be observed in the actual phenomena. But then the question remains: so what about the social form of the categories of the logic of the concept? I mean, like Hegel himself thinks that like the state the modern state is so powerful that can, and so ethical that can somehow tame the sphere of the market and somehow like bring about the categories of the logic of the concept. But Marx did not think that. Marx think that no, the state cannot function like that. And I think the history of modern capitalism since that time up to now, it has become clear, I think, that the state cannot discharge that function. So I mean, maybe for Hegel, it functions as a kind of like perhaps like misunderstanding on the part of Hegel that the categories of the logic of the concept already are embodied in modern society, but for Marx somehow functions as a kind of utopian categories that somehow, although he doesn't talk about like the exact structure of post-capitalist society, but the way that I read it is just the like the logic of the concept just shows or outlines the structure of the post-capitalist society. So about your so and then about your second and third point, that is, I mean, it is yes, it is true that first, I mean, it is important for me to say that for Hegel, for Marx, capital does not employ the categories of the logic of the concept. Most importantly, because capital does not have a kind of intentionality. It doesn't have the kind of freedom that for infinite freedom that Hegel would Hegel regard as a kind of mark of subjectivity. But capital is just kind of blind mechanism that repeats itself again and again. So it is not. It doesn't have, properly speaking or exactly speaking, does not have a purpose because it's not also intentional, and it doesn't have a purpose. It's just as a kind of motive that just repeats itself again and again, and that accords to the logic of the essence. But at the same time, you are correct in the sense that so when Marx talks about the logic of capital, at the same time in the book Capital, he also talks about the struggle of the workers, and he talks about like how like people can combat the rule of capital. So like capital can be read like in two ways. One is just the structure of society in capitalism, and the other from the viewpoint of the agents and that are involved in capitalism, and those can try to change as a collective, not as an individual. As a collective can try to change the social relations of production in capitalism. So there is some kind of agency involved, and that for that one certainly needs the categories of the logic of the concept. But I put it aside just first because of methodological reasons, because my book was more about the structure of society and rather than an agency. Second, one has to distinguish between two different meanings of agency. One level of agency, I am talking about in terms of social theory, not in terms of like pure philosophy. One is a kind of agency that is like everybody has, and like, for example, I can bring my hand up, or I can just follow the rules of capital. But that is a kind of weak agency. That's not a true agency in the sense of, like, for example, romantic conception of agency, that kind of like deep individuality or deep agency. That deep agency is not possible within capitalism. It is only possible as a resistance to capitalism within capitalism. Yes, but as a resistance to the laws of capital in a collective way. I mean, like when I wrote the book, I mean, actually this is because of reformulation of my dissertation. In the dissertation, in the conclusion, I tried to show that the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept in social terms is how people can become conscious of their subjugation and thereby try to change the very relations of production that in fact subjugate them. But that is also not some kind of a matter of ideology or whatever. It's a kind of collective praxis. So I agree with you in terms of grasping the deep agency or the genuine agency of individuals, not in the discussions of autonomy that is always now people talk about autonomy in Hegel. That I don't think like that autonomy in capitalism is possible. But in terms of like genuine agency, yes, one requires some kind of categories of the logic of the concept. But in our everyday life, even if we do philosophy, even if we do like any kind of work, we have to follow the logic of the capital. We have to have some kind of very weak kind of agency to be able to do that. But that is a part of also the logic of the essence. One can conceive it in terms of the logic of essence. So, yeah, I think I tried to. I mean, one thing is also like the transition from substance to subject, as you say, that like the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept is the transition from substance exactly to the subject, and one has to have an account to do that. But because I tried to focus on social aspects, and I felt that the only way that is fruitful to understand this transition is not in terms of purely philosophical categories, but rather in terms of individuals and agents as a collective trying to resist the dictate of capital, and that only happens through collective praxis. But thank you very much, Karan, for your excellent comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you both very much for that exchange. And with that, I will open the floor to questions. So go ahead and use the raise hand function, and I'll call you in the order that you raise your hands. So our first question is from Abu. Can you hear us?
Yeah, hi. That's it. Just I guess they're calling me Abuk. My name is Andrew Buckwalter, and yeah, I just heard about this event, and so I'm glad that I could participate and listen to this very interesting talk and those interesting comments. I think there's a lot to be said, but I just want to raise a couple of comments about the use of the logic. I think that all these terms that were discussed, power, totality, fate, contingency, these are all there. But for Hegel, they're all used in a very distinctive way. They're not used, Hegel employs conventional terms, but he reworks them in ways that defy conventional usage. And I think that's part of what's going on in what was mentioned, the sort of the movement from essence to concept. Power for Hegel is not domination. That's Gewalt, that's violence. Hegel speaks of power as, as freedom. The power, or he talks about creative power, the power of thought, the ability to maintain oneself in otherness. And that's what power is. Violence is the opposite of that. Likewise, totality. Totality is not unity. Totality is a self-apprehending totality, which is based again on the differentiated notion of freedom. Likewise, fate. He says fate is blind only because it's not comprehended. It's not fully expressive of freedom. Or then contingency too. He speaks of absolute contingency, which is that which is to be able to be self-grounding and self-determining. So he uses all these terms, but he does so in a certain revisionary way. I think it's important because he doesn't want to be a utopian. He says, I'm going to use these conventional categories, but try to explode them from within. And it's just he's sort of revealing a type of immanent critique in using these terms. And my sense is the presentation focused too much on the conventional understanding of these terms, which is exactly what I think Hegel is rejecting. So a few comments there.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your excellent question. Yes, there is it is clear that Hegel redefines the terms. So, for example, essence, he has a very specific conception of essence that cannot be, for example, dissociated from appearance, and or for example, about the concept of substance, he has a completely non-Aristotelian conception of substance, because at least Aristotle, according to the categories, that substance is somehow independent. For Hegel, substance is somehow dependent on accidents, and when there is a kind of mutual relation between substance and accidents, and they co-define each other, but eventually there's some kind of power relation of substance over accidents. Yes, that is so. In the logic of essence, yes, he. It's part of it because it's I had to be in this presentation. I had to be omit some of the details of Hegel's presentation in the logic of essence that I have written in the book in detail. Yes, Hegel redefines categories. He uses the same philosophical categories, but in a new way. But nonetheless, that is, if one reads the text very closely, the logic of essence, as I understand him, is a different enterprise than the logic of the concept. The logic of essence is giving, even if one wants to somehow if one doesn't want to think about capitalism per se, one can say also the logic of essence provides the very basic categories for natural scientific discourse. It gives the categories of law and causality and even totality. These are helpful for understanding natural scientific discourse. But it is in the logic of the concept that ideas of self-comprehension, agency, as you suggest, it is over there. Now, there are two possibilities. When one reads the logic of the concept, then one reads it back to the logic of essence and reread the logic of essence. So if one read the logic of essence from the viewpoint of the logic of the concept, then it would be the thing that you are suggesting. But I think that at least at the social level, that transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept has not transpired. So one has to read the logic of essence from the point of view of the logic of essence, and not from the point of view of the logic of the concept. And it is when one reads the text closely, it is clear. I mean, like in the logic of the concept, he uses the term freie Macht, free power. And that is exactly, he says, that's the logic of agency, that is the free power. But in the logic of essence, he uses like blind power, those categories, like necessary power, blind power. He doesn't use the category of free power. So, I mean, like textually, I think that it is the ideas of comprehension and agency and whatever comes with agency and subjectivity is in the logic of the concept and not the logic of the essence. Thank you. I don't know whether I have addressed your concern. Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from Bernardo. I think you're muted. Or we can't hear you in any case. No. Yeah, I can see that you're not muted, but we can't hear you, I think. Maybe I'll go to the following question. If you, I don't know if restarting Zoom or fixing something with the what do you call it? The voice or whatever, we'll come back to you. And if you still can't speak, then we can put it in the chat. Yeah. Okay, so Farhad.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting talk, Arash. So yeah, my first question is how arbitrary these logical categories are applied to capitalism as just a form of social domination. Because yeah, in historical materialism, we have different forms of social domination. And I wanted to learn more about what characteristics you have picked to define this specific form of social domination as capitalism. So I was wondering how you could factor in the class division in terms of a bourgeois class, as you were saying, the private ownership of a means of production on the one hand, and on the other hand, this specific moment in Marx that labor force itself is construed as a commodity. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on this very specific moment in capitalism that Marx would pick as a distinguishing mark from every other form of domination. So yeah, I was wondering how this application of logical categories to capitalism can be justified in terms of these distinguishing characteristics that Marx would describe, basically labor force as a commodity, the transaction of not just every commodity, but human labor force. And then the process of accumulation of capital. And I wasn't wondering if it can relate to previous questions as if the logic of the concept can come into the picture. So how would you, in the end, describe Marx's critique of political economy as regards the accumulation of capital through this class division, and how that can be read through logic of essence, or can it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farhad. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the future.
Yeah, I hope so as well.
Thank you. So the thing is, like the way that I mean, I actually like just I give it some kind of historical example of the way that I wrote the dissertation and the book. So I was reading the science of logic, and I wanted to write a dissertation on the science of logic, and I was reading Marx separately. I mean, it hadn't to be related to each other. But at some point, I realized that, especially when I took attention to the category of power, that if one reads Power, then it becomes clear that Marx has some kind of Marx critique of political economy in Capital, in the book Capital, is somehow presupposes logical categories of the logic of essence. So so it is not like it's not like some kind of arbitrary in the sense that I have somehow applied the logical categories of logic of essence to Marx. I mean, or to capitalism. Rather, it was the case that I realized that Marx has some kind of essential, the structure of Marx critique has some kind of essential a priori ingredient, and that kind of essential a priori ingredient has to be understood through the logic of essence, and cannot be understood on Marx's own terms. It has to be understood in Marx's terms. So it's not a matter of like some kind of arbitrary application. It was a kind of the way that I found that there is a deep interrelation between the two. But the point is, yes, so for Hegel, substance is something that reproduces itself independently of accidents somehow. I mean, of course, accidents, they have some power, but eventually it's the power of substance. It has an autonomous logic. And one thing that makes Hegel's substance very close to Marx's conception of capital has also autonomous has a kind of autonomous logic. So no matter one is a worker or one is a capitalist, one has to behave in such a way to feed into the category, into this self-perpetuating system of capital accumulation or capital. Well, and capital by definition is defined in terms of accumulation. So if there is no accumulation, there is no capital. And again, the other major category for Hegel, for Marx is wage labor, and wage labor, and one can speak about it in terms of labor power as well. But wage labor is something that presupposes equality and freedom of individuals. So Marx never says that people are not equal and free. It presupposes equality and freedom, but then he says that it somehow it gets completely undermined by the logic of capital, but it requires equality and freedom. So, and I felt that, like as I said, I mean, one can trace this kind of equality and freedom because it's kind of external equality and external freedom. It's not it doesn't really touch the inner core of individuals in terms of the categories of logical being. So logic of being, and then in terms of the categories of category of shine. So I think there is enough similarities to justify the project, that to show that the two somehow can be read together and somehow complement each other. Thanks, Bahar. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a number of new questions all of a sudden with not much time. So if I could ask you to keep your questions and your responses as brief as possible, so we can fit them all into the formal part of the session. Bernardo, does your mic work now? Okay, no. So if you want to type your question into the chat, and I will take the next one from Almira.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. Thank you, Professor, for your talk, Professor Abazari, and thank you for Karen Eng, do I pronounce your last name correctly, for your fantastic response. I have two questions to Professor Abazari. One is about the concept of agency as a non-romantical, say non-Rousseauist concept, but a concept within the realm of resistance of capitalism. And despite capitalism, it works within the dynamics of capitalism. You write this in your book, and you mentioned it in your talk as well. My first question is, this view resembles a lot to Michel Foucault's concept of power as resistance. So I'm wondering why your book do not mention his work in terms of this issue. And it's a great and wonderful work that I have learned a lot from your work, as Professor Ang also mentioned. Can I jump to my second question, or would you prefer answering the first? Okay, I'm jumping to second question. It is about Republican idea of positive freedom and its link to social domination as impersonality. So you refer a lot to republicanism and Republican ideas of freedom and individuality and power, a lot to Aristotelianism. And in your book, when you're talking about Isaac Berlin's distinction between negative and positive freedom, and on Republican freedom as the intentional power and coercion, I'm wondering also why, by your perfect and fascinating link between Republican idea of freedom with its character of non-impersonality, why did you prefer not to include a discussion on Claude Lefort's work of Republican idea of freedom and totalitarianism and democracy? As we all know, he describes democracy as a free locus of power, where the power is impersonal. So it is very much linked to your fantastic work. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Almira. Thank you so much. Thank you for your excellent questions. I mean, the first question, yes, there are some similarity between my rendition of Hegel and Foucault insofar as power is somehow permitted in our social relations, and power is both restrictive and at the same time productive. So, and Foucault is also very clear that it is power for him is not only restrictive, it is also productive. Yeah, but I mean, just in terms, and actually I read a lot of Foucault just because my book was about power, so I felt that I have to read Foucault to have, but eventually I realized that I shouldn't write about it. It's just a matter of, I wanted the book to be as short as possible. It's still a long book. So that was a kind of and I couldn't just mention it in passing. Either I have to discuss it in detail, or so it was more for the economical purpose that I didn't discuss Foucault. About Republican ideal of freedom, that is, I mean, there is a tradition of republicanism that is called republicanism in the work of Philip Pettit and Quentin Skinner. That is not the thing. They are very explicit that we are not talking about positive freedom. So they want to distinguish themselves from both negative conception of freedom and positive conception of freedom, and they say that the way is a third way. And that is the way that they understand. I mean, that's a different discussion. But about but again, that is like Claude Lefort. I have read some of his work, but not this one. If you send me the article or the book, I can. If I read it, then it would be very helpful.
Yes, with pleasure. With pleasure.
Okay, thanks. Yes, but again, that is also something that we reside in, like in terms of systematicity in Hegel's logic of the concept, because the idea of self-determination and the idea of the idea of, as you say, like Lefort's Republican idea of self-determination, then these, if it has to be discussed, it has to be discussed with the categories of the logic of the concept. And in the book, I was always under the pressure just to stick to the project of the book and just don't go out of my project. So I didn't at all discuss it. But thanks very much.
Okay, our next question is from Michael.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you all for all the talks and comments and everything. Yeah, so I have a personal question, I guess, for you, Arash. So do you yourself believe that there could be or could exist some kind of economic organization which would reduce or eliminate or reduce, let's say reduce alienation and social domination to such a degree that is much that capitalism could not get to? And if yes, is this in a way that how Marx sees it, or do you have another conception, or are we, I don't know, I leave it at that.
Thanks. Yes. I mean, first, I wanted to distinguish like my account from Adorno, because Adorno, just in passing, Adorno is, as far as I understand him, is against totality in general. He always, any kind of totality for him is oppressive. But I wanted to say in the book that no, there can be a totality or system of economic system that is not oppressive, and there can be, and that is a kind of the logic of a post-capitalist society. Yes, I do think, and there are some, how it can turn out to be exactly, I don't know, but there are some accounts about market socialism. I don't know whether it works or not, or anyway, like any kind of socialist or democratic planning, that there's another idea that people talking about democratic planning, that the decisions about economy comes from below, and there is no like centralized state in the sense that has some kind of power over other people. But again, I stick in some sense to Adorno's way of doing philosophy, that he doesn't want to do positive philosophy. He doesn't give some kind of positive image of the future society. He just wants to criticize the existing society. I think just the logical contour of the future society, what the main principles are, can be known, but exact institutional structure, I don't think that we are in a stage to talk about it at all. But thanks.
Okay, so we've got a final question. We will, after this question, we will leave the session open for a more informal chat. But we have time for one more question for the formal part, and that is from Shahab.
Yes, thank you, Arash. I'm happy to see you here. So I have a question regarding the relation of power in philosophy of right, and I wonder if we can trace the asymmetrical relation of power that you mentioned in chapter 2, I guess, in the philosophy of right, because when Hegel discusses the problem of poverty there, he says that there is a tendency in civil society to accumulate wills in the hands of a few people. And then he says that the distribution of wills is always disproportionate. And more importantly, maybe he says that poverty is a natural product of the unrestricted activity of civil society. So, and then he discusses that with the division of labor and abstraction of tasks and more mechanization, then machines take the place of laborers. So the one who has the capital profits from the profit, takes the profits of the production. So at the end, he says that there are always a class of people who are poor, and it's a necessity of the logic of, not the logic, but the activity of civil society. And these poor people cannot take advantage of the, they cannot get the advantages of civil societies, such as freedom and education and so on and so forth. So I wonder if we can say that the Hegel's account of asymmetrical relation in science of logic is in line with his account of the activity of civil society in philosophy of right? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, like Hegel himself uses the categories of the logic of essence to describe the structure of like the bürgerliche Gesellschaft, of the bourgeois society or the economy. So he talks about contingency, necessity, and he talks about the totality, even like in different terms. And he talks about, he also talks about opposition between individuals, in terms of when they are competing with each other. And Hegel was also like what people call him an idealist, but he was not really an ideal. I mean, he had had a very great realistic impulse, and he diagnosed the major problems of society. But I think that first, his economic theory is not developed enough. I mean, and he cannot explain. I mean, he just asserts it empirically, I mean, the philosophy of right, but he cannot explain why there will be like a kind of like extreme inequality in terms of distribution of wealth. I mean, he doesn't have enough categories to explain that. The only thing, and the reason that he doesn't have it, I mean, I think that he doesn't use the category of opposition effectively, although he uses it in the logic of essence. So he uses the category of opposition to explain how people in modern society are competing with each other. He says that the civil society is Kampfplatz. It's a place of battle, field battle between individuals. But he thinks that these individuals who are competing with each other are more or less on an even playing field. So they are like opposing each other, but they're on an even playing field. But I think that like Marx's account shows that they are not on an even playing field. Some are much better off, and they have different, I mean, so it's not like, even if there's a competition, it's not like this. It is an even, and that has to be understood in terms of opposition. And Hegel, in his philosophy of right, doesn't have like really a concept of class. He's used one time the term class, but he says that different professions have some kind of states, they have some kind of stand, and they are more or less harmonious with each other. I mean, maybe one of them are more wealthy than the other, but more or less they are okay. But if he used the category of opposition in his account, then he would realize that modern society is divided in terms of classes, not in terms of a state. Thanks.
Okay, so that brings the formal part of the session to an end. I want you to join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you very much to Arash and to Karan for your wonderful contributions. We will leave the Zoom link open informally if you want to discuss something or ask a question. And I will at the same time invite you to our next session, which is on November 17th, on the topic of the German 18th century debate on the indestructibility of the soul. And I'm putting the link into the chat. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and see you on November 17th.